Somewhere deep in the cotton belt of central Alabama, courthouse archives from 1848 hold an entry that clerks reportedly attempted to destroy on 3 separate occasions. The record describes a transaction that violated no state law, yet caused such uproar that 2 wealthy families abandoned estates totaling more than $40,000, an amount that would exceed $2 million in today's money. What could make a legal arrangement so disturbing that grown men refuse to speak of it out loud? The answer lies in a father's desperation, a daughter dismissed as worthless by the standards of her society, and a single decision that would ultimately claim 11 lives across 2 counties. The truth did not simply fade, it was buried. Witnesses contradicted themselves under obvious pressure, and entire pages from the inquiry disappeared so cleanly that archivists believe the removal was done by someone with access to government files. Before we continue with what happened on the Yansfield plantation that spring, I need you to do one thing. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss any story like this. And let me know in the comments, what state are you watching from? I always wonder where people are tuning in from when they hear the forgotten chapters of American history. Now, let me tell you about Caroline Yansfield and the bargain that haunted Alabama for generations. The scandal that eventually destroyed the Yansfield name began with something far more ordinary, a girl nobody wanted. The Yansfield plantation covered nearly 800 acres along the Cahaba River in that fertile stretch of Alabama where cotton grew so thick it looked like snow that never melted. By 1848, the state had been reshaped by King Cotton, with plantations spreading like a slow-moving shadow across former Creek and Choctaw lands. The Yansfields had arrived in 1831, part of that early wave of settlers who seized opportunity in the forced removal of native people. Their wealth came from cotton, their grand house from enslaved labor, and their reputation from the kind of fragile respectability that required constant vigilance. Richard Yansfield owned 41 enslaved people, placing him firmly within the planter class, though still well below the aristocracy he longed to join. His wife had died giving birth to their only child, Caroline, in 1829. The girl grew up surrounded by everything money could buy, yet marked by something that made that wealth meaningless, a visible difference that rendered her unsuitable for the only future her community offered women of her rank: marriage. Caroline had been born with a pronounced wine-colored birthmark covering the entire left side of her face, a deep maroon stain stretching from her temple to her jaw. In an era when female beauty was seen as proof of moral purity and any blemish suggested divine disfavor, her appearance branded her as unmarriageable. It didn't matter that she could read French, played harpsichord beautifully, or possessed her mother's sharp mind and dry humor. In the marriage market of Antebellum, Alabama, she was considered valueless. Richard tried. Between 1844 and 1847, he arranged meetings with 6 potential suitors. Each visit ended in the same humiliating rejection. The final one, a widower from Montgomery who was desperate enough to consider a bride with generous dowry, took one look at Caroline and declared he would rather remain alone than marry a woman who looked marked by misfortune. Caroline had been 20 then, sitting in her father's parlor in a dress that cost more than most families earn a year, while man appraised her like livestock and dismissed her in seconds. After that, something in Richard Yansfield cracked. Neighbors noticed he stopped attending church gatherings, stopped discussing Caroline's prospects, and stopped pretending the situation would resolve itself. Caroline withdrew into the large Yansfield house, spent her time in a library or music room, visible to the enslaved people who served her, but increasingly invisible to white society. The plantation itself ran on the labor of men and women whose names existed only in Richard's ledgers, their lives valued solely for their output. Among them was a man called Silas, though the African name he was born would have been beaten out of him long before he arrived at Yansfield. Silas stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, possessed immense strength that made him indispensable during harvest, and demonstrated a quiet intelligence Richard found useful but unsettling. Unlike many enslavers, Richard allowed Silas to learn carpentry, believing that a skilled worker increased the plantation's value. It was purely economic, exactly the kind of calculation Richard excelled at. What he didn't know, what he could not know because the barrier between master and slave prevented such understanding, was that Caroline and Silas had been exchanging careful, stolen moments of conversation for nearly 2 years. It began innocently enough. Caroline reading in the library while Silas repaired a window frame, both pretending not to notice the other, while Caroline's voice filled the room with words Silas wasn't supposed to understand. Over time, these accidental encounters became intentional. Caroline would mention which room needed work. Silas would appear, working slowly, listening. They never addressed a growing awareness between them. But by early 1848, they felt something that terrified them both, a genuine connection across a boundary their society demanded remain absolute. This was Alabama in 1848, where the social structure relied on rigid lines between white and black, enslaved and free, male and female. Countless laws existed solely to prevent what was forming between Caroline and Silas. For a white woman to feel anything for an enslaved man wasn't just scandalous. It was considered madness, corruption, something requiring severe correction. But Richard Yansfield was beginning to consider the unthinkable, driven by a desperation years in the making. He was 54, watching his daughter approach 30 with no prospects, knowing that once he died, she would be alone in a world that had no place for unmarried women without male protection. His brother had already made it clear that Caroline would not be welcome in his home. The family reputation, he said, could not survive sheltering a spinster who embodied unfortunate heredity. By March of 1848, Richard had begun staying up late in his study, drinking imported whiskey and examining every option he had left. His ledgers told a simple truth. The plantation's value was tied to its acres and its enslaved laborers. Caroline would inherit both, but a woman could not manage a plantation alone. Society forbade it, and more practically, she would become prey for every schemer, overseer, and traveling fraud in the county. He needed a way to secure her future, yet every respectable path had been blocked by her face, by the mark that rendered her unmarriageable under the rules of their world. On the night of March 17th, 1848, Richard Yansfield summoned Silas into his study. The request alone was alarming. Enslaved people were never invited into the master's private rooms unless punishment was imminent. Silas entered expecting violence, his muscles already tightening in anticipation of blows. Instead, he found Richard seated behind his heavy walnut desk, his face drawn with a fatigue that seemed to go beyond mere sleeplessness. Richard studied him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he spoke words that sounded like they belonged in some alternate world where none of the usual rules applied. He told Silas that he was going to be freed, not immediately, but conditionally. The condition was marriage to Caroline. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Silas stood frozen, unable to process a statement that violated every law of reason he had ever known. White men did not free enslaved men. White fathers did not offer their daughters to them. These things did not happen. They could not happen inside the rigid structure of their society. Richard continued speaking, his tone low and deliberate, laying out terms with precision of a lawyer, because that's exactly what this was, a contract attempting to solve an impossible problem through an unthinkable arrangement. Silas would marry Caroline in a private ceremony. Afterward, he would receive freedom papers. Caroline would inherit the estate upon Richard's death, but Silas would run it, giving orders to the same people who had worked beside him in bondage. The marriage would shield Caroline socially, while granting Silas what had once been unimaginable: freedom, authority, and land. But there were more details, ones that revealed how long Richard had wrestled with this plan, how desperately he needed it to succeed. The marriage would not be entered into the public registry. Silas would take the name Silas Carter, a common enough surname to raise no suspicion, and he would be introduced as an overseer from Georgia. The story would be simple. Richard had hired a new manager, and Caroline, in some stroke of fortune, had married him. Normal, proper, acceptable. The enslaved community would be told that Silas had been sold to Georgia. The truth, that one of their own had crossed the ultimate boundary and married into the master's family, would destabilize the plantation beyond repair. The white community would be given only the barest details, and even those would be lies upon lies, layered carefully to hide an arrangement that violated every unwritten rule of the South. When Silas finally found his voice, his response was careful. He asked what would happen if he refused. Richard's answer was devastating in its simplicity. Nothing would happen to Silas directly, but he would be sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where enslaved people rarely survived more than 5 brutal years. And then Richard would offer a proposal to someone else, someone more desperate, someone with fewer principles. What Richard didn't say, what he didn't have to say, was that this was not only about protecting Caroline, it was about absolving himself. It was his desperate attempt to undo a lifetime of guilt for raising a daughter in a society that punished women for failing to meet impossible standards. Richard was trying to purchase redemption using the only currency he possessed, a man's freedom in exchange for taking responsibility for a woman the rest of the world had already rejected. Silas asked for time to think. Richard gave him until sunset. Then he dismissed him with a flick of his hand, the same gesture he used when discussing crops or fence repairs, as though they had not just rewritten the fabric of their universe. Silas walked straight to the carpentry shed, standing among the curls of wood and half-finished tables, trying to comprehend what had just been offered. Freedom, marriage to a white woman, land, power over people who had once shared the same chains. Everything he had dreamed of, wrapped in something that felt deeply, disturbingly wrong. He thought about Caroline, the woman he spent 2 years carefully not thinking about. The conversations they had never fully had, the tension neither dared acknowledge. He thought about what it meant to be freed, but only as part of a bargain, not as a right, but as a transaction. He thought how he would explain leaving his mother, his sister, everyone he knew in bondage, to live in a white woman's house. That evening, Silas met Caroline in the library, a meeting Richard had arranged deliberately. She stood by the window with her back stiff, her hands clenched. When she turned, they looked at each other without the layers of silence that had always shielded them. For the first time, neither pretended. Caroline spoke first, her voice level despite the faint flush on her unmarked cheek. She told him she knew what her father had proposed. She also told him, with the bluntness of someone who spent her entire life being judged, that she understood the arrangement offered him something precious, while giving her something she had never expected to have. She wasn't foolish enough to call it love. She didn't even call it a real marriage. She named it correctly, a transaction that could help them both survive, if they could find a way to make it work. But then she said something that made it clear she had already thought through more of this than Silas had. She warned him that if he agreed, he would be stepping into a life of constant suspicion. His freedom papers would always be doubted by white men who assumed any black autonomy was fraudulent. He would have authority over the plantation's enslaved people, but that authority, Caroline warned, would come with resentment from people who would see him as a traitor, someone who had climbed into the master's house by lying beside a white woman. He would stand in a no-man's land, not accepted as white yet no longer comfortably black, trapped inside a social space that made him a target for hostility from every direction. She also told him, with a bluntness that bordered on cruel honesty, that she had no expectation of love. She didn't expect him to want her, desire her, or feel anything beyond the courteous cooperation needed to keep up appearances. What she offered was a partnership, 2 outcasts forging a fragile alliance in a world that had no place for either of them. Silas's reply was equally direct. He said he would agree on one condition, that whatever happened between them, whatever arrangement they kept, she would never wield her whiteness against him. He had seen what happened when white women accused black men of impropriety. Men hanged for misunderstandings, for startled glances, for deliberate lies. He refused to enter this arrangement without her explicit promise. He needed her oath that she would never threaten him, never use the enormous power that her skin granted her to harm or control him. Caroline gave her word. They shook hands, a formal gesture sealing an informal, illegal, and unthinkably scandalous agreement. Then Silas went to find Richard and gave him his answer. The wedding happened 3 days later in Richard's study, with only the three of them present. A Methodist circuit preacher, who owed Richard a sizable gambling debt, performed the ceremony, rushing through vows and leaving immediately without writing anything in his official ledger. Richard paid him $50, a staggering sum, for his silence and his memory loss. Silas became Silas Carter Freeman, and Caroline Yansfield became Caroline Carter, wife of a man whose freedom was exactly 20 minutes old. Richard handed Silas his freedom papers that same night, documents describing him as born free in Georgia, sold south by impoverished parents, and having purchased his liberty through years of skilled labor. They were elaborate forgeries, expensive and convincing, and the fact that Richard had them prepared months in advance revealed that this solution had been forming long before Silas ever realized it. The explanation given to the enslaved community was simple. Silas had been sold to a cotton mill in Mobile. It was plausible enough that no one questioned it. The explanation given to the white neighbors was only slightly more complicated. Richard had hired an overseer from Georgia, a man handy with tools who had assisted Caroline with repairs. They had grown fond of each other, married quickly, and Caroline would stay on the plantation under her husband's management. Unusual, certainly, but not illegal. Strange, undeniably, but technically defensible. What nobody explained was why Richard Yansfield, so obsessively protective of his reputation, would allow such a rushed marriage. What nobody questioned was how a supposedly modest carpenter from Georgia had managed to present himself as suitable husband material for a planter's daughter. What nobody examined too closely was whether Silas Carter's papers were genuine, why he read as fluently as any educated man, or why he sometimes forgot to respond to his new surname. The first month unfolded in rigid routine. Silas moved into the main house, into rooms prepared for him. At first, he slept in a separate bedroom. Neither he nor Caroline ready for the intimacy their marriage theoretically permitted. He began managing plantation business, issuing instructions to people who, only weeks earlier, had been beside him in the fields. He tried to balance authority with caution, navigating the subtle resistance that always arises when a man's past undermines his present. Caroline withdrew even deeper into the house, emerging only when necessary, allowing Silas to appear as the visible head of operations. Each evening they had dinner together. Carefully polite meals where they discussed crop yields, broken gates, weather forecasts, anything except the true nature of their arrangement and the boundary they had shattered. The enslaved community sensed something was off. They didn't know what. They believed the story about Silas being sold, because nothing contradicted it. Yet the shift in power unsettled them. The white overseer who had worked for Richard for years quit abruptly, claiming illness, though everyone knew it was because he refused to take orders from a man he suspected was not entirely white. A new overseer was hired, a drifter from Mississippi who asked few questions and enforced discipline with a casual cruelty that made Silas's stomach twist. But Silas couldn't stop him, not without revealing the precarious lie balancing his authority. By midsummer, the arrangement had become something resembling stability. Silas and Caroline cooperated well, even forming a tentative affection, though they never fully understood whether it grew naturally or simply because they had no one else. They began sharing a bedroom to maintain household appearances. 2 enslaved women were assigned to Caroline's service, and they noticed subtle changes. Caroline less withdrawn, Caroline occasionally laughing at Silas's dry remarks, Caroline resting a hand on his arm when speaking to him. The plantation thrived under Silas's management. He implemented improvements, a basic irrigation channel, crop rotation in depleted fields, and a work schedule that eliminated many of the random punishments the former overseer favored. The enslaved community remained wary, but the absence of constant violence slowly built the beginnings of grudging respect. But in July, everything began to unravel. A woman named Dinah, who had lived on the Yansfield plantation for 15 years, asked to speak with Silas privately. In the carpenter's shed, where he often retreated to think, She told him something that froze him in place. She recognized him, not just as someone who had once labored beside her. She had known him his entire life. She had known his mother, who died during a cholera outbreak in 1842. She had known his sister, who had been sold south in 1844 to pay off Richard's gambling debts. Dinah said she had been relieved when she heard he'd been sold to Mobile, hoping he might find kinder work. But then she saw him giving orders, saw something in his voice or his posture, something unmistakable. She pieced together what no one else dared imagine. The Georgia overseer was Silas, somehow free, somehow living in the master's house, somehow married to the master's daughter. She didn't know how it. Suspicion was still quiet, still unspoken, but it had begun to take shape. Thin as smoke, but just as dangerous. And Dinah had been right about one thing. Secrets like theirs never stayed buried. She didn't know how it all happened, but she knew that it had. And she knew others in the quarters were starting to notice the cracks, small, almost invisible details that didn't belong. The way Silas knew too much about the plantation's older routines. The way he sometimes slipped into familiar gestures and rhythms with people he supposedly had never met. The way Caroline looked at him was something that resembled genuine affection, rather than the polite distance most white wives kept from hired overseers. Dinah told Silas she wouldn't expose him, but she also warned him that secrets this large didn't stay quiet for long, that someone else would uncover eventually, and when they did, the consequences wouldn't stop with him. They'd fall on Caroline, on Richard, and on the entire enslaved community that would inevitably be accused of helping hide the truth. Then Dinah asked Silas a question that struck deeper than anything said so far. Did his freedom, his marriage to a white woman, his authority, his relatives' safety, did any of it justify abandoning the people he left behind? His sister was still enslaved, still suffering, still someone's property. His mother's grave was an unmarked mound in a neglected plot where enslaved people were buried without names. Meanwhile, he was playing master, issuing orders to people who could easily be his own kin, protecting his position by upholding the very system that had destroyed the life he once knew. Silas had no answer. He told Dinah he understood her anger, that he valued her silence, and that he needed time, just a little more time, to figure out what to do. She agreed reluctantly, but only because she believed he wasn't beyond reaching. That night, Silas told Caroline everything. He told her Dinah had recognized him. He told her about the rising suspicion in the quarters. He told her the uneasy truth, that their arrangement had been unstable from the beginning, and the ground beneath them was shifting faster than either had prepared for. And then he told her about his sister, about the guilt he'd carried since the moment he accepted freedom on the condition that he leave everyone else behind. Caroline's response revealed how much he'd changed since the spring. She admitted she'd been thinking about the same contradictions. She admitted she had started questioning everything she'd been raised to believe about slavery, property, and worthiness. Living beside Silas, talking with him as a human being, not as an accessory to a plantation, had shattered ideas she'd once thought were moral truths. She told him their arrangement only protected them if they continued participating in the injustice that shaped their world. Then she proposed something that could either liberate them or destroy them beyond saving. They should free Richard's enslaved people, not suddenly. That would bring suspicion, violence, possibly a lynch mob, but gradually, through sales to northern buyers who would free them on arrival, through documents labeling certain people as having earned freedom for exceptional service, through carefully forged travel passes, through quiet transportation along routes used by free black communities and abolitionist networks, through methodical, cautious steps that would empty the plantation of enslaved labor without drawing immediate attention. It was illegal. It was dangerous. It could lead to their ruin if they succeeded, and their deaths if they failed. But Caroline argued that they had already crossed every boundary that protected their world. They had already broken every unwritten rule. This transgression, at least, would serve a moral purpose instead of merely shielding their own comfort. Silas pointed out the obvious obstacle. Richard was still alive. He still owned the enslaved community. Nothing could be done without his consent, and Richard had shown no evidence of believing slavery itself was wrong. His gesture towards Silas had been rooted in guilt, not morality. Caroline's answer was blunt. They needed to convince Richard, or they needed to wait until he died, and then act immediately as soon as she inherited. Either way, they needed to prepare. They needed to identify safe destinations, discreet contacts, reliable couriers. They needed to gather money. They needed to map routes north. They needed to learn how to vanish people without leaving a trail. Over the next several weeks, they began planning. Quietly, carefully, never writing anything down, testing the limits of what they could do without drawing suspicion. Then, in September, Richard Yansfield collapsed during supper. The local doctor diagnosed heart disease and gave him 6 months at most. Richard accepted the news with eerie calm, as if he'd been expecting it, and as if this was just another failing harvest or bad investment to be managed. What he did not expect was how his weakening condition shifted the balance of power he had tried so hard to control. As Richard grew frail, Silas and Caroline assumed greater responsibility. The enslaved community began to realize that Silas wasn't just an overseer. He was being treated as if he were next in line. He was going to be the permanent master after Richard's death. This realization stirred new tensions, new fears, new whisper conversations. Then, in October, a man calling himself a slave hunter arrived at the plantation, claiming he was tracking a fugitive who resembled Silas. The man claimed the fugitive had papers, forged or stolen, and had escaped from a plantation in Georgia 3 years earlier. The papers the man carried were obvious fakes. The dates didn't line up. The physical description was vague enough to apply to half the men in the county, but none of that mattered. They only needed to be believable enough to create doubt. Silas showed the man his freedom papers, the elaborate forgeries Richard had prepared. The slave hunter examined them, noting small inconsistencies, and suggested that perhaps the matter should be taken before the local magistrate. Caroline stepped in, offered the man $50 to verify his records more thoroughly. He counted the money, smiled, and rode off without another word. They had been extorted, not investigated. But the incident exposed just how fragile Silas's identity really was. Any white man could threaten him with a few sheets of paper and a story. And what came next was even worse. Word of the slave hunter's visit spread quickly, carried by the overseer who had witnessed the encounter. Suddenly, neighbors who had previously accepted Silas as a peculiar but legitimate overseer began to murmur. Where exactly in Georgia had he come from? Why were his papers notarized by someone no one had ever heard of? Why had a northern cotton broker visiting in November remarked that Silas's voice sounded distinctly like someone raised in Alabama, not Georgia? The suspicion was still soft, still indirect, but it had a shape now, and it was growing. They argued quietly, their voices sharp but low, because they both understood the danger of even speaking these thoughts aloud. Catherine insisted that a slow, careful plan was the only method that offered any chance of success. Dinah countered that slow only ever meant someone else's suffering, someone else waiting, someone else left behind, someone else losing hope while watching others walk toward freedom. But in the end, she agreed to go, not because she forgave Catherine, and certainly not because she believed the system could be dismantled one person at a time. She agreed because she wanted to survive long enough to see a world that had never once allowed her to imagine survival. Fletcher collected the group at dawn, driving a simple wagon that looked no different from 100 others traveling Alabama roads. No one paid attention. No one suspected that inside that wagon were people being smuggled not toward another plantation, but toward an entirely different life. Catherine watched them leave from the upstairs window, her hand pressed to the glass, her breath fogging it. Silas found her there an hour later. She told him nothing. She couldn't. Not yet. Meanwhile, the white community's suspicion did not merely grow. It began to organize. Neighbors who once whispered privately now discussed their concerns openly behind closed doors, emboldened by rumors spreading through the county. They spoke of protecting Southern values, but what they truly wanted was to ensure that no black man, freed or not, gained legitimate control over land, wealth, or power. By late winter, a group of planners had quietly hired an attorney from Montgomery to investigate Samuel Carter Freeman's papers and the legality of his marriage. They claimed they wanted to verify propriety. What they wanted was ammunition, loopholes, technicalities, anything that could nullify Catherine's marriage and seize the Yansfield estate. And they were getting close. In early January, Catherine hosted a small supper to maintain appearances, inviting 3 neighboring families and a local minister. She introduced Silas as her attentive husband, her steady partner, her moral support. She smiled graciously, spoke warmly, and told stories about renovations, church events, and harvest expectations. But she couldn't control what people noticed. They saw that Silas interacted too comfortably with the enslaved workers, that he spoke with the confidence of someone who had lived on the land for years, that he recognized faces and histories he shouldn't have known, that he moved through the house not like a visiting overseer, but like someone raised within its walls. The whispers hardened into quiet certainty. Then came December, Richard's death. It was peaceful, a slow exhale in the presence of Samuel and Caroline, with the same physician who had predicted his decline standing nearby. A modest funeral followed. Neighbors extended sympathy to Caroline and polite distance to Silas. Richard was buried beside his wife beneath a stone that said nothing about the choices he made to secure his daughter's future. Under Alabama's coverture laws, everything Catherine inherited immediately became Samuel's legal property. The land, the structures, the accounts, and every enslaved person still living on his estate. A man born in bondage now owned people he'd once worked and suffered beside. It was an impossible situation, fraught, volatile, and deteriorating quickly. The enslaved community had pieced together enough of the truth to know something was deeply wrong. Some viewed Silas as a traitor, someone who had escaped bondage not by rebellion, but by accepting a place in the master's household. Others pitied him, seeing a man trapped in an arrangement engineered by desperation. But none of them trusted him. How could they? He was both them and not them, both ally and oppressor, both man and master. The white community, meanwhile, had moved from suspicion to pursuit. They wanted proof Silas was not free, proof his papers were forged, proof the marriage was illegal, proof the plantation could be seized through probate litigation or community intervention. They wanted the land. They wanted to correct what they saw as a defilement of Southern hierarchy. And in January of 1849, Catherine made a decision Silas would never have allowed had he known. She began selling enslaved people in secret. She sold them to a Quaker trader named Josiah Fletcher, a Pennsylvania merchant who had been quietly purchasing enslaved people throughout the South and spiriting them north to freedom. He had done this work for 7 years without a single rescue failing. Over 200 men, women, and children freed, not one recaptured. His credentials were impeccable: legitimate business papers, letters from northern factories, purchase agreements that looked perfectly ordinary. Beneath that paperwork was an invisible network of abolitionists, free black communities, sympathetic clergy, and people willing to risk everything to dismantle slavery one transaction at a time. He had heard about the Yansfield plantation after Richard's death. The network had ways of knowing when a household was unstable, when a sympathetic heir took over, when a new marriage created tension, when shifts in power made certain actions more possible. Catherine responded to his first letter with coded language of her own. They met once, on a guise of visiting a sick relative, in a Montgomery boarding house parlor lit only by kerosene lamps. Fletcher spoke plainly. He could move any person she sold him. He could guarantee freedom. He could pay market prices. And he could leave no footprints behind. The risk on Catherine's side was catastrophic, but she no longer cared about risk. She cared about doing one right thing in a lifetime of inherited wrongs. In January, she sold 3 people, Peter, Rachel, and Rachel's brother Marcus. The night before they left, she told them everything. Rachel cried from disbelief. Peter demanded to know why. Catherine's answer was simple. I refuse to keep doing what my father taught me to do. She forged bills of sale showing transfers to a Mississippi cotton mill. She showed Silas those forged documents, claiming she needed cash for repairs. He wanted to believe her so badly that he didn't ask the questions he should have. In February, she sold 5 more, including Dinah. This was different. Dinah knew Silas's origins. Dinah knew the truth. Catherine woke her after midnight and took her to the kitchen house. She told her everything. The network, the route north, the promise waiting at the end. Dinah's reaction stunned her. She wasn't relieved. She wasn't grateful. She was furious. Freeing a few people doesn't change what this place is, she said. You're choosing who gets saved and who gets left behind. Who made you God? Catherine could not defend herself. She said only that she was doing what she could, that freeing everyone at once would trigger immediate suspicion and prosecution. Dinah shook her head. Slow freedom is still slavery, she said. Someone always gets left behind. They argued, while others were allowed to leave. And no matter how Samuel tried to frame it, as strategy, as necessity, as caution, it still meant that human beings were being forced away for freedom while watching their friends vanish into the night. The argument between Catherine and Dinah had lasted over an hour, their voices rising despite every risk. Each woman defended a position that made sense from her vantage point, but looked selfish and cruel from the others. In the end, Dinah accepted freedom only because refusing would help no one. But she warned Catherine not to expect gratitude, not for mending a wound white society had inflicted in the first place. The confrontation shook Catherine more deeply than she expected. She had begun to imagine herself as brave, as morally awakened, as someone risking everything to do what was right. Dinah's fury forced her to face a painful truth. Even her bravery operated from a position of inherited power. Even in her attempts to free people, she was still exercising control over Black lives, still choosing who was saved and when. She was liberating, but she was also deciding. Still, she continued the sales, pushing them faster through March and April. 7 people in March, 9 in April. Each sale followed its own private ritual, a late-night conversation in the kitchen house or the library, a confession of truth, tears of joy or suspicion, or something like Dinah's exhausted rage. Fletcher's arrival at dawn with forged papers and quiet resolve, a wagon departing toward Montgomery, carrying people toward a freedom too surreal to fully believe. Silas discovered a plan in late April, when a woman named Sarah came to him with trembling hands and a whispered confession. She'd been selected for the next group leaving in May, but she didn't know whether to trust Catherine. What if it was a trap? What if this was just a scheme to identify enslaved people willing to escape, so they could be punished as examples? Her fear was rational. Enslaved people lived under a system where trust could be used like a knife, where kindness was often bait, where expressing desire for freedom could be turned into proof of insubordination. Sarah asked plainly, "Is this real, or am I about to get myself killed?" Silas's answer revealed just how much he had transformed over the past year. He told her everything. He told her the truth about his own past, about being born on this very plantation, about the mother buried in an unmarked grave behind the south field, about the sister sold south to pay Richard's gambling losses. He told her the truth about his marriage, about Richard's desperate arrangement, about the accidental evolution of that arrangement into something that resembled genuine partnership. He told her he understood her fear because he lived every day of his life expecting betrayal. Then he told her she should trust Catherine, that the danger was real, but so was the offer of freedom, that he would stake his own life on Catherine's intent. But he also told her something harder, that Catherine's motives were a tangled mixture of real conviction and inherited guilt, that even Catherine probably didn't know which part of herself was leading, and that it didn't matter, because the result was the same: freedom for people who had never dared imagine it. Sarah accepted the truth. She would go, but Silas was shaken, not by the plan, by the fact that he had been excluded entirely from it. Catherine had been risking everything behind his back. She had navigated danger alone. She had chosen who lived and who left, without involving the man who was supposed to be her equal. That night, Silas confronted her. What followed was the first true fight of their marriage. He accused her of treating him like a child, of deciding the fate of the entire community without him, of denying him agency and choices that affected them both. She fired back that she had been protecting him, that if the plan failed, she wanted at least one of them to have a chance of survival. Silas argued that her protection was just another form of control, that she was still thinking like a white woman deciding the fate of black lives, rather than like a partner sharing power with her husband. Catherine retorted that Silas's freedom was barely a year old, that the law would seize any opportunity to drag him back into chains, and that her caution was practical, not patronizing. Round and round they went, each argument cutting deep, because each was painfully true. At last, exhausted and drained, they reached an agreement. Silas would be fully involved in all future planning. They would act together, for better or worse. They acknowledged that their marriage, created in coercion, shaped by necessity, was still learning how to exist at all. Over the next months, they moved as one. They accelerated the sales. They took greater risks. They became bolder. The plantation's enslaved population dropped from 43 to 22 by August, then to 15 by October. Every sale required careful choreography, matching Fletcher's routes, forging believable documentation, preparing families for the terrifying journey north, and managing the reaction of those who remained behind, watching their community dissolve piece by piece. The emotional toll was suffocating. Catherine and Silas found themselves in an impossible position, choosing who lived and who waited. They tried to keep families together, but sometimes logistics made that impossible. Sometimes individuals had to be sent alone because Fletcher's wagon couldn't handle larger groups safely. Sometimes a person had to stay because their absence would spark questions they couldn't afford. Those who remained grew bitter. Some looked at Catherine and Silas as liberators, imperfect but trying. Others saw them as arbiters of fate, no different from the white families who had held power for generations. Others accused them of playing favorites or delaying freedom out of cowardice. One man named Isaiah confronted Silas in August, demanding to know why he had been passed over 3 times while others left. Silas explained truthfully that Isaiah's carpentry skills made him too valuable for the plantation's facade, that losing him too early would draw immediate scrutiny. Isaiah heard only another justification for exploitation. Freedom delayed is freedom denied, he told Silas. Don't ask me to stay in chains so someone else can walk free. That's the same sacrifice white folks always expect us to make. Silas had no answer, because Isaiah was right. The strategic requirements of their plan forced some people to wait in bondage, while others escaped into daylight, and the resentment was growing. Others went free. That reality was unjust even when it was necessary, harmful even when unavoidable. All Silas could offer Isaiah was a promise. He would be in the next group leaving, no matter the risk to their cover. But promises became nearly impossible to keep as pressure from the outside world tightened around them. Neighboring planters had noticed the shrinking workforce and knew the estate couldn't function on only 15 enslaved laborers. The lawyer they'd hired, Harris and Griggs, shifted focus from Silas's freedom papers to Catherine's sales, tracking every name she'd listed as a buyer. Most buyers were fabricated, tied to non-existent cotton operations in Mississippi or Georgia. When Griggs received no responses to his inquiries, he began traveling to the plantation she named, discovering one after another that none had purchased a single person from a Yansfield estate. By October, he had collected enough proof to take his findings to county authorities. He presented documentation showing that Catherine Yansfield Carter had falsified at least 28 sales, records pointing to people who did not exist or to businesses that denied ever buying anyone. The implication was unmistakable. The enslaved people had either been freed illegally or helped escape with Catherine's assistance. The sheriff hesitated. Catherine was white, from a respected family, and legally entitled to sell her property as she wished. But Griggs argued that falsifying records constituted fraud, that aiding fugitives violated federal law, and that Catherine's actions threatened the economic foundation of the entire cotton system. If white landowners could secretly free enslaved people without consequences, the whole Southern hierarchy collapsed. Worse still was the rumor Griggs deliberately spread, that Catherine hadn't freed people for moral reasons. She'd done it because her marriage to Silas Carter had corrupted her racial loyalty. He claimed she had betrayed her class and her race by marrying a man he insisted was not genuinely born free, and that she was now compounding that betrayal by undermining white wealth to support black freedom. It was an argument rooted entirely in protection of white supremacy, and it worked because that system existed to preserve itself at all costs. Pressure built rapidly through October. Catherine and Silas knew their time was almost gone. They planned a final effort. Fletcher would return in early November, and they would send the remaining 15 enslaved people north all at once, then flee themselves before they could be arrested. But they waited too long. On November 11th, one of the formerly enslaved men Catherine had freed 8 months earlier, Benjamin, was recognized by a slave hunter in Philadelphia. Benjamin had been living openly as a free worker at a textile mill, using forged papers Fletcher's network provided to all escapees. The slave hunter, however, had been searching specifically for fugitives from Alabama using descriptions Griggs himself had supplied. Benjamin was arrested, interrogated, threatened with forcible return under the Fugitive Slave Act, and subjected to hours of psychological torment meant to break his resolve. Terrified and believing he had no other choice, he eventually confessed. He had been freed by Catherine Carter of Alabama, transported north by a Quaker merchant who helped him obtain papers. Within days, the information reached Alabama, carried personally by Griggs, who had traveled to Philadelphia to confirm his suspicions. He returned with Benjamin's signed statement, descriptions of the merchant, and enough evidence to secure arrest warrants for Catherine and Silas on charges of slave stealing, aiding fugitives, fraud, and violating federal fugitive laws. On November 18, 1849, Sheriff James Hartwell arrived at the Yansfield estate with the warrant. Silas was named as a co-conspirator. The sheriff brought 4 deputies, anticipating a standoff or attempted flight. Instead, he found Catherine and Silas sitting calmly in the parlor, Catherine reading, Silas reviewing crop notes, both looking up with an eerie lack of surprise. Hartwell read the charges aloud, his formal tone hiding his discomfort with arresting a white woman of her social standing. When he finished, Catherine asked only one question. "May we have time to put our affairs in order?" Hartwell granted 3 hours, not because it was standard procedure, but because Evie felt conflicted. Deputies took positions at every exit while Catherine and Silas prepared. They used the time with methodical precision. They burned every incriminating document. Catherine's list of freed individuals, their destinations, Fletcher's contacts. Silas burned correspondence with Fletcher and anything that could expose abolitionists across the region. As the fire devoured their records, they wrote letters. Catherine wrote to Fletcher, warning him never to return. Silas wrote to contacts in Pennsylvania, begging them to help the 15 still on the plantation. Sarah, assigned to attend Catherine before the arrest, watched the entire scene with wide, frightened eyes and agreed to smuggle the letters out once the sheriff took them away. Then Catherine sat down at her desk and did something that would define the way this story lived in memory. She wrote a confession, a detailed, meticulous document she titled A True Record of the Events at the Yansfield Estate, 1848 to 1849. She filled 16 pages with everything. Thomas's desperate arrangement that bound her to Silas. Silas's origins as an enslaved man on the very land he'd briefly come to control. Their decision to use her inheritance not for profit, but to dismantle the system that had shaped their lives, the underground network that helped them, and the moral reasoning behind breaking laws they'd once been taught to revere. The confession was astonishing not only for its honesty, but for its deliberate legal framing. Catherine took full responsibility. emphasizing that Silas had opposed many of her decisions and often urged restraint. This was partly true. Silas had been more cautious throughout their efforts, but it was also a strategic shield designed to protect him from the worst consequences. More importantly, Catherine articulated the evolution of her conscience. She described growing up believing slavery was natural, moral, and sanctioned, how living with Silas had torn those beliefs apart, how daily life beside a man who had survived bondage made her old worldview impossible to maintain. She framed her choices not as abolitionist ambition, but as moral necessity born from witnessing another human being's pain. She even offered a surprisingly compassionate reinterpretation of her father's final act. She argued that Thomas's arrangement, forcing a marriage between his daughter and an enslaved man, was not only desperation but a dim, unspoken recognition that racial boundaries were inventions sustained by cruelty. By freeing Silas through marriage, Thomas had performed an act with far-reaching implications he never fully grasped, and Catherine positioned her own choices as simply following that logic to its moral conclusion. If a racial boundary could be broken for marriage, why not for everything else? This interpretation painted Thomas in a generous light, likely more generous than he deserved. But Catherine needed a narrative that might persuade sympathetic readers, especially Northern journalists who valued family loyalty even when they disapproved of disobedience. When she finished writing, she signed and dated the confession, then handed it to Dinah with explicit instructions. The document should remain hidden unless she and Silas were executed. If they died, Dinah was to deliver it to Northern abolitionists who could use the truth to fight slavery. If they survived, the confession must be destroyed. Catherine then gave Dinah forged freedom papers, backdated to suggest Thomas had freed her before his death, and $50, the last of the money she had not already spent liberating others. Dinah accepted both with the same complicated expression she had worn months earlier, gratitude intertwined with anger, appreciation tangled with resentment, and understanding that Catherine meant well tempered by the reality that her ability to help existed only because she had inherited the wealth and power built on Dinah's suffering. Their final exchange was brief. Dinah promised to keep the confession hidden until the proper moment. Then, after a long pause, she added quietly, "You did better than most. That matters, even if it wasn't enough." Catherine couldn't speak. She simply nodded and turned away before emotion broke the controlled focus she'd maintained since the sheriff's arrival. Silas spent his last hours of freedom walking the grounds, saying goodbye to the places that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He stood silently over the patch of earth where his mother lay in an unmarked grave, surrounded by the forgotten dead of the plantation. Lives reduced to ledger entries, memories kept alive only in the minds of those who survived long enough to remember. He visited the carpenter's shed where his life had changed forever, where he had first grappled with Thomas's impossible offer, where he had learned fragments of freedom while still encircled by bondage. He then met with each of the 15 people who remained enslaved, offering apologies for failing to free them sooner, trying to explain why some were able to leave while others remained behind. The conversations were raw. Some accepted his apology, knowing he and Catherine had done more than most white Southerners would ever attempt. Others rejected his words, insisting that apologies meant nothing as long as chains remained. Isaiah, the carpenter who confronted Silas months before, spoke the sharpest truth. "You got to be free for a year. You lived in the big house, gave orders, slept beside a white woman, and walked around like you were one of them. That's more than most of us ever get. So don't apologize for getting caught. Apologize for thinking that a little freedom for a few of us covered up the fact that the rest of us stayed in chains." Silas tried to explain that he intended to free everyone, that getting caught had interrupted the process, not ended it. But Isaiah cut him short. "Plans don't matter. Results do. And the result is 28 people free, 15 still enslaved, and you acting like this was noble instead of just choosing who got saved and who got left." The blow landed because it was true. Catherine and Silas had chosen the order in which people were freed, shaping who tasted liberation and who remained behind. It had been necessary, yes, but necessity didn't make it just. It only made it unavoidable. When the 3 hours expired, Sheriff Hartwell found Catherine and Silas standing in the entrance hall, dressed for travel, carrying nothing but a small bag containing clean clothing. They walked calmly to the wagon that would take them to the county jail, climbing in without a single protest or dramatic gesture. As they departed, Sarah and several other enslaved people watched from the upper windows of the big house, their expressions impossible to read. Fear, grief, resentment, and something like awe blending behind the glass. The county jail was a squat brick structure at the center of town, built to confine criminals awaiting trial. Catherine and Silas were separated at first. County policy required men and women to be held apart, but their appointed lawyer, a young, underpaid attorney named Douglas Kemp, argued that separating a married couple served no legitimate purpose. Because Catherine had spent nearly every dollar freeing people, Kemp had been appointed automatically. He was inexperienced, earnest, and overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case. After his petition, the sheriff relented, moving Catherine and Silas into a single 10 by 12-foot cell with one barred window, 2 narrow beds, and a bucket for sanitation. Even in confinement, the racial hierarchy persisted. Their cell was cleaner and brighter than those in the basement, where black prisoners were kept in near darkness. They spent the first night in absolute silence, each wrestling privately with the reality of what was coming. There would be a trial, but it would be a formality. The evidence was overwhelming, and neither intended to lie about what they had done. The sentence for slave stealing in Alabama was death by hanging, and what they had done was a textbook definition of the crime. Around midnight, Catherine finally spoke into the dimness. "Do you regret it?" Silas waited a long moment before responding. "I regret we didn't move faster," he said quietly. "I regret that 15 people are still enslaved because we hesitated, because we were still trying to protect ourselves. But I don't regret trying." They talked until morning, dissecting every decision, every moment they had doubted themselves, every path they might have chosen. They wondered if they should have freed everyone immediately after Thomas's death, accepting certain capture in exchange for freeing all 43 people at once. They wondered whether Silas should have refused Thomas's offer entirely, stayed enslaved, perhaps attempted escape north on his own rather than accepting conditional freedom through marriage. These conversations changed nothing, but they needed to examine every choice while they still had time, needed to confront whether their actions had been truly moral or simply convenient morality shaped by circumstance. Just before dawn, Catherine voiced a thought neither had dared say aloud. "We're going to die trying to be good inside something evil, and the evil will outlive us. And the people we freed may be hunted down again. Maybe all of this ends up meaning nothing." Silas answered with a quiet firmness. 28 people tasted freedom, he said. Maybe only for days, maybe for months, but they tasted it. They walked without fear for the first time in their lives. That isn't nothing. Even if they're caught tomorrow, those moments matter. It was barely optimism, but it was the closest thing to hope either of them had left. The trial began on November 27th, 9 days after their arrest. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Marcus Wellesley, a rising political figure who saw this case as a perfect stage to prove his loyalty to Southern order. In his opening statement, he framed Catherine and Silas not simply as criminals, but as traitors, people who had violated sacred social trust and threatened the survival of Southern civilization. His case was brutal in its efficiency. He presented Catherine's falsified sale records, testimony from Harris and Griggs detailing his investigation, and Benjamin's signed statement from Philadelphia describing how he had been secretly freed. He brought planners from neighboring estates who testified about the suspicious decline in the Yansfield workforce. He brought a handwriting expert who identified multiple forged signatures. But the most damning blow came when Wellesley exposed Silas's true origins. He called enslaved witnesses who testified that Silas had been born on the Yansfield plantation, had lived as an enslaved man until late 1848, and that his sudden emergence as Silas Carter, free man of Georgia, made no sense. He entered Thomas's ledgers into evidence, Records that listed Silas as property valued at $1,200 until 1848, after which his name vanished. Wellesley argued that Silas's freedom papers were fraudulent, his marriage invalid, and his entire legal identity built on lies. The implications were enormous. If Silas had never been legitimately freed, then his marriage to Catherine was void, her inheritance remained solely hers, and Silas could legally be re-enslaved while Catherine could be prosecuted as though she had acted entirely alone. The defense was meager. Young Kemp attempted to argue that Catherine had been manipulated, seduced, or coerced by Silas into betraying her class. It was a disgusting argument rooted in racist fantasies about black men corrupting white women, but was the only strategy that had any chance of saving Catherine's life. Catherine refused to participate in it. When Kemp called her to testify, she obliterated his defense. She openly took full responsibility for every choice she made, describing Silas as the cautious one, the hesitant one, the man who urged restraint while she pushed forward. She narrated her entire moral evolution, how living as Silas's wife forced her to confront the humanity of enslaved people, how slavery became intolerable to her conscience, how she had chosen to use her inheritance for liberation rather than profit. She did not express regret. She did not soften her statements. Her testimony was a confession delivered with clarity, with steadiness, and without a trace of shame. People rather than continue profiting from their bondage. When Wellesley cross-examined her, he tried to portray her actions as irrational, evidence of a woman suffering from some moral or mental defect that required treatment, not punishment. Catherine rejected that framing instantly and without hesitation. She insisted her actions were entirely rational, that freeing enslaved people was the only logical conclusion once one acknowledged their humanity, and that what truly bordered on insanity was a system that treated human beings as chattel. Their exchange quickly grew heated, with Catherine refusing to accept any premise suggesting slavery was natural or that her efforts to dismantle it were criminal in any moral sense. At one point, Wellesley asked bluntly, "Do you not recognize that your actions violated the laws of Alabama and the United States?" Catherine answered with icy clarity, "I recognize that they violated those laws. I do not recognize those laws as just. There is a difference." The courtroom erupted, spectators shouting accusations and slurs, the judge hammering his gavel repeatedly until order returned. The judge warned her that any further defiance would result in contempt charges. Catherine said nothing else, but her position was unmistakably clear. Silas's defense unfolded differently. His lawyer, Martin Chase, was more seasoned and had taken the case because he found the legal puzzles intriguing, not because he sympathized with abolition. Chase argued that Silas had been legitimately freed by Thomas Yansfield, that his marriage to Catherine was therefore legal, and that he bore no criminal responsibility for her subsequent actions beyond failing to stop her. Chase tried to present Silas as a passive bystander to Catherine's dangerous idealism rather than an active participant. The argument might have worked if Silas had cooperated. Instead, when Chase called to testify, Silas unraveled the defense as thoroughly as Catherine had undone hers. He testified that he had known everything, that he had actively planned the liberation efforts, arranged meetings with Fletcher's network, and helped determine the order in which people would be freed. He described excruciating moral choices involved, balancing rapid emancipation against the need for secrecy to avoid detection. He acknowledged the wrenching calculus that led to 28 people escaping while 15 remained enslaved, and he admitted that the decision had been imperfect and painful, but still better than allowing all 43 to remain in chains forever. Then Silas did something no one in that courtroom expected. He described slavery from the inside. He explained what it meant to be owned as property rather than recognized as a person, what it did to one's spirit to live with the constant threat of sale, separation, beatings, or being worked to death, what it felt like to be denied the most basic autonomy while your value was measured in dollars. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, not because the audience felt sympathy, but because they were unaccustomed to hearing an enslaved man speak openly about the system that supported their entire society. When Wellesley cross-examined him, He tried to attack Silas's credibility by suggesting that a man born in bondage was inherently untrustworthy and intellectually inferior. Silas responded with calm precision, pointing out the contradiction at the heart of Wellesley's argument. If enslaved people were too inferior to be believed when speaking in their own defense, how could they be legally punished like full moral agents when committing supposed crimes? His rhetorical question illuminated a deep inconsistency in Southern legal ideology, the desire to treat enslaved people as less than human when denying rights, but fully human when imposing punishment. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably, but no one addressed the contradiction. The trial lasted 3 days. On the afternoon of November 29th, the jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every charge: slave stealing, conspiracy, forgery, and fraud. The judge asked whether either defendant wished to speak before sentencing. Catherine declined. Silas stood and said only, "28 people are free because of what we did. That is all the statement I need." The judge sentenced them both to death by hanging within 30 days, the minimum waiting period required by state law. He ordered that after execution, their bodies be buried outside consecrated ground, their graves unmarked, and their names removed from family records as punishment for betraying their race and society. Catherine and Silas returned to their shared cell to await execution on December 27th. During that month, they received almost no visitors besides their lawyers, whose appeals were swiftly rejected. Young Douglas Kemp apologized repeatedly to Catherine for the weakness of his defense. Catherine assured him no defense could have saved them, that the outcome had been predetermined by evidence and by the social order they had challenged. In those final weeks, Catherine and Silas settled into strange, intimate routines. They played cards with a deck provided by a guard who quietly pitted them. They read books from the jail's small library. They talked about their childhoods, about memories they had never shared, about the pieces of themselves they had kept hidden during their frantic year of clandestine liberation. Ironically, they became more genuinely married in that cold cell than they had ever been in the big house. For the first time, they had space to know each other without fear, without rushing. Then, on December 20th, just 7 days before their scheduled execution, something extraordinary happened. Josiah Fletcher arrived at the jail, requesting entry as their spiritual advisor. By law, condemned prisoners were entitled to religious counsel, so the sheriff admitted him for an hour-long visit. Fletcher brought news from Pennsylvania. All 28 people Catherine and Silas had freed were alive and safe, scattered across cities and rural communities, living under new identities with documents identifying them as born free. Benjamin, the man whose coerced testimony had triggered their downfall, had recanted, claiming he had been intimidated and that his statement was false. Fletcher's network had helped him escape Philadelphia before Southern authorities could seize him. Even more astonishing, Fletcher had begun rallying Northern support. Abolitionist newspapers had published their case, framing them as martyrs for human freedom. Religious leaders across several northern states wrote letters urging the governor of Alabama to grant clemency. Pennsylvania's legislature even passed a formal resolution condemning Alabama for prosecuting 2 people whose only crime, as they put it, was recognizing the humanity of the enslaved. None of this could actually save Catherine and Silas. Alabama was not about in northern outrage, but it meant their story had grown far larger than their own lives. Their deaths would ripple outward. They would become symbols, used to fuel movements already gaining momentum. Fletcher also brought a request from prominent abolitionists. Would Catherine and Silas allow their final letters to be published after their execution? Their words, they argued, could reach thousands, could turn abstract debates into human truths, could expose the immorality of a system that punished people for acknowledging basic humanity. Catherine and Silas agreed. Over the following days, they wrote their final testimonies. Catherine wrote about her transformation, from a woman taught to see slavery as natural to someone who could no longer tolerate its cruelty. She wrote about discovering the impossibility of remaining good while participating in systems built to make goodness impossible. She wrote about hope that future generations would be braver, cleverer, and freer than the options available in 1849. Silas wrote about what slavery had taken from him: his mother, his sister, his childhood, his autonomy, his name. He wrote about how bondage warped the soul, how it demanded fear as a permanent state, and how resisting it required a courage most people never recognized. Their letters would later be published widely, reprinted in abolitionist papers from Boston to Cincinnati, becoming quiet but powerful ammunition in the fight against slavery. Catherine and Silas never lived to see their impact. On the night of December 26, they received their final meal: roasted chicken, warm bread, vegetables from local farms, better food than the jail typically offered. They ate together quietly, speaking of small things, avoiding the dawn they knew was coming. Just after midnight, when the jail was quiet, Silas asked Catherine the same question she had once asked him. "Do you regret it?" Catherine took her time. "I regret that we couldn't free everyone," she said. "I regret that 15 people are still enslaved. I regret that we won't live to see 30. But I don't regret trying to be better than we were taught to be." They held each other through the last hours of darkness. At dawn on December 27th, guards arrived to prepare them for execution. But what happened next became the subject of contradictory testimonies and official reports that don't align. The official record claims Catherine and Silas were found dead at sunrise, having poisoned themselves with arsenic smuggled into the jail the night before. The jail physician reported classic symptoms: abdominal pain, convulsions, vomiting. But inconsistencies raised doubts. The wine they allegedly poisoned was inspected by guards, and none reported signs of tampering. Their bodies showed bruises consistent with struggle, contusions not explained by poisoning. And the cell door, strangely, was found unlocked, which should have been impossible if this were suicide. Unofficial accounts, whispered among jail workers and later recorded by a northern journalist, suggest a different story: that Catherine and Silas were murdered by county officials who wanted to avoid the public spectacle of hanging a white woman for aiding enslaved people. A public execution would have drawn crowds, forced officials to justify executing a woman for moral defiance, and invited northern scrutiny. Poison, on the other hand, allowed officials to frame their death as voluntary, preserving the social fiction that Catherine and Silas recognized their guilt rather than being executed by the state. A third theory, based on scattered witness testimony, claims vigilantes broke into the jail that night. Townspeople, outraged by the idea of a white woman freeing enslaved people and living with a black man, may have forced their way inside and beaten the couple before forcing poison down their throats. Reports describe unusual activity near the jail that night: groups of men gathering and dispersing, guards who seemed distracted or frightened. The bruises on the bodies, the unlocked door, the suspicious timing, all align with this version. The truth was likely a mixture of these possibilities, a chaotic reality smoothed into a neat official narrative. What is certain is that Catherine and Silas died in that cell on December 27, 1849, and that the authorities recorded their deaths as suicides to avoid the uncomfortable consequences of honesty. Their bodies were buried that same afternoon in unmarked graves outside the county cemetery, their burial sites deliberately obscured. No one wanted abolitionists to turn their resting place into a shrine or symbol. Only a handful of people attended the burial, all sworn to secrecy about the exact location. Meanwhile, the 15 enslaved people who remained on the Yansfield estate at the time of Catherine and Silas's arrest were sold at auction on January 4th, 1850, just 8 days after the couple's deaths. They were sold individually, not as families sold off one by one to scattered buyers across the region, their futures unrecorded and unknowable. But the 28 people Catherine and Silas had managed to free stayed free. Pennsylvania officials refused Alabama's extradition requests, citing procedural irregularities that everyone understood were intentional. Fletcher's network helped each person establish new identities, secure work, and disappear into northern cities where no one questioned paperwork that labeled them as born free. Some eventually joined the abolitionist movement, speaking publicly about the horrors they had escaped and the unlikely liberation they owed to a white woman and an enslaved man who had risked everything. Their testimonies added human urgency to political arguments and fueled the growing northern resistance to slavery. Denina, who had carried Catherine's forged freedom papers, also reached the north, settling in Philadelphia, building a life as a seamstress, and later marrying a freeborn man from New Jersey. She kept Catherine's confession hidden for 30 years, exactly as instructed. In 1879, she handed it to William Lloyd Garrison, Jr., a journalist researching Alabama's hidden histories. Garrison published excerpts, sparking controversy and renewed debate. Northern readers praised Catherine and Silas as moral martyrs. Southern readers dismissed the confession as abolitionist propaganda or outright fabrication. Historians argued over its authenticity, wondering whether anyone in the 1840s could truly have crossed such dangerous racial and social boundaries in pursuit of a higher moral vision. But the confession's factual core aligned with surviving documentation. Trial transcripts, courthouse ledgers, scattered witness testimonies. The basic events were undeniable. A white plantation heiress had married a formerly enslaved man secretly freed by her father, inherited an estate, and used that inheritance to liberate people rather than profit from them. She and her husband had been arrested, tried, and executed. What those facts meant morally would be debated for generations, but the facts themselves were real. The Yansfield estate was auctioned in February 1850, purchased by a mobile cotton investor named Charles Thornberry, who rebuilt it into one of the region's most productive plantations. Thornberry expanded operations, bought more enslaved labor, and pushed the land relentlessly until Union troops arrived during the Civil War, prompting mass flight of enslaved people and collapsing the plantation's viability. The main house burned in 1868 under suspicious circumstances. Some blamed formerly enslaved people seeking justice. Others blamed resentful Confederates unwilling to let a hated symbol remain standing. Most likely it was accidental, but symbolism outweighed logic. After the fire, the land was divided into parcels and sold off. The Yansfield plantation ceased to exist as a distinct entity, absorbed, renamed, erased. The places where Catherine and Silas had walked, where they had built their improbable marriage, where they had planned their clandestine liberations, where they had agonized over who could be freed and who had to wait. All of it vanished beneath new farms, new fences, new owners. Nothing marks their graves today. Nothing marks the place where Thomas devised his desperate scheme, where Catherine made her choices, where 15 people slipped into freedom before the system reasserted its control. There are no plaques, no memorial stones, no acknowledgments. The story lives only in fragments. Catherine's confession preserved in a Massachusetts archive, brittle trial records buried in courthouse drawers, whispered family histories among descendants of those who escaped or those who remained enslaved. Most Americans have never heard of Catherine Yansfield or Silas Carter and have no idea that two people once tried to dismantle slavery not through war or politics, but through marriage, deception, and moral rebellion. But the people they freed remembered. Descendants of those 28 carried stories forward. Tales of a white woman who sacrificed everything, of a once enslaved man who briefly held power and used it for liberation rather than profit. Over time, the stories grew simplified, mythologized, sometimes distorted. But the essential truth survived, that some people resisted slavery even when resistance meant death, that some chose moral courage even when the law called that courage a crime, that some crossed boundaries the world insisted were unbreakable. What the story means, if it means anything at all, remains uncertain. Catherine and Silas tried to solve an impossible problem and ultimately failed. Most of the people they hoped to save remained in bondage. They themselves died young and violently. The system they opposed endured another 16 years before the Civil War finally shattered it. Their actions changed almost nothing in terms of immediate outcomes. But perhaps that is the wrong measure. Perhaps goodness matters even when it collapses under the weight of evil. Perhaps resistance has value even when resistance fails. Perhaps crossing unjust boundaries is meaningful even when society destroys those who dare. Perhaps 28 people tasting freedom is worth the lives of 2 who never got to see the world they hoped to create. Or perhaps it is only tragedy. 2 people caught in the gears of a brutal system, making desperate choices that harmed as much as they helped, dying without changing the course of their world. Maybe there is no lesson at all. Only the undeniable fact that these events happened, flickered briefly into public memory, and then faded into obscurity, preserved only in dusty archives and half-remembered stories. What remains certain, however, is that the line Thomas Yansfield attempted to blur between enslaved and free, between black and white, between property and person, are still being negotiated today, still causing harm, still forcing people into choices no one should ever have to make. Slavery ended on paper, but its consequences echo across generations. The racial boundaries it created were legally erased, yet they survive in practice. The institution collapsed, but the logic behind it, who deserves power, who deserves safety, who deserves dignity, still shapes American life. Catherine and Silas crossed those boundaries for a moment, paid for that crossing with their lives, and left behind a record some people worked to bury, while others quietly preserved. Their story didn't change the trajectory of history, but it exposes something essential about what that history was. The staggering human cost of systems that treated people as commodities, the impossibility of remaining innocent within structures designed to spread guilt across everyone they touched, the bravery required to choose resistance when survival demanded obedience. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps we cannot ask more of history than to show us what people did when trapped in cages they didn't build, to show us the choices they made, the cost they paid, the lines they dared cross, and the punishments they endured for crossing them. Catherine and Silas tried to be better than the world that formed them. They failed more often than they succeeded. They died young, frightened, exhausted, and burdened with regrets. But they tried, and that effort, however incomplete or tragic, is worth remembering even when we cannot fully determine its meaning, its value, or whether any of us would choose the same path in similar circumstances. What do you think about their story? Do you believe the full truth ever surfaced? The historical record is fragmented, letters lost, testimonies conflicting, memories altered by fear and time. There are pieces we will never recover, truths that died with Catherine and Silas, secrets buried beneath unmarked soil in forgotten corner of a rural cemetery. If these hidden chapters of American history fascinate you, stories that challenge simple narratives and force us to confront uncomfortable realities, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who values history, that refuses clean moral boundaries, who understands that the past was complicated, chaotic, and full of people making impossible decisions with no right answers. And leave a comment telling me what you think. Did Catherine and Silas make the right choices? Or were they doomed from the moment they agreed to participate in Thomas's desperate plan? I read every comment, and I truly want to know how others interpret these events. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another forgotten, unsettling corner of American history that most people have never heard of.